This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is net neutrality. I have two guests who will be speaking on it, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Net neutrality is the subject. I have two guests who have opinions about it. On the left is Aram Sinreich, and on the right is Roger Kay. Let me just give both of you a few minutes to just tell who you are, what you do, and your opinions on the matter. Aram, if you will go first and give a little background about yourself.
Sure. I'm a communication professor at American University. I've written a bunch of books, some of which have to do with internet governance issues and the intersection between law and technology and culture. And my basic take is that net neutrality has been an essential component of what has enabled the internet to thrive and to give us all of the wonderful products and services that have changed our culture over the last 20 years. And that the Republican effort to end it is part of a larger deregulatory strategy that's going to turn the internet into a giant cable television system, at best.
I used to work back in the late 90s, early O's at AT&T in their collections department, and usually it's for business services then. And one of the things I know, even with net neutrality, today it's almost infinitely more cheap to deliver services than it was 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, even with dial-up, I was paying, working at AT&T, like $14.95 a month. Now I'm paying like over $60 just for internet broadband access. And I guess one of the things I always wonder is, if it's so goddamn cheap, why do they keep increasing the fees? And a lot of the fees, if you look on your internet bills, I know even 20 years ago, like interstate connectivity fees, are just a lot of bullshit, because there's no nothing is crossing state lines except electrical impulses. So if companies are really just riding and ripping people off now, is net neutrality just a way to just fleece them even more?
Is that a question to me?
Yeah, for you, and then I'll go to Roger. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I mean, look, two things. Number one, big companies that have regular billing relationships with consumers are always looking for ways to pad out those bills, sometimes legally and sometimes fraudulently. And oftentimes it's not until regulators step in or there's a lawsuit till we find out whether it is legal or not. There are certainly many cases throughout American history of ISPs adding elements to their bills that it turned out they were not allowed to add, and they've been smacked down and rolled back. But like I said in my brief introduction, the net neutrality policy changes are part of a larger suite of communications policy changes in the U.S., which can't be understood singly, but only collectively as part of an effort to really change the shape of our communications infrastructure and to change the power dynamics in terms of who gets to participate and on what terms in that communications infrastructure. So it's certainly giving ISPs more freedom to charge fraudulently or to pad out their bills to consumers is a tiny element, but it's not even on the top 10 list of the damaging second-order effects of reversing net neutrality.
Well, we'll get to that in a moment. Roger Kay is my other guest. Roger is the president of Endpoint Technologies. If you could give a little bit of background about yourself and what Endpoint does.
Sure. I'm Roger Kay, and I'm the founder and president of Endpoint Technologies Associates, and we are a technology market analyst firm. I've been associated with technology since the mid-1970s, when my father founded the first e-commerce business. It ran on mainframes, actually Xerox XDS systems in tandem, and it allowed brokers and institutions on Wall Street to trade stock. It was a new idea at the time. And in fact, Michael Bloomberg came along and sat down at my father's feet and said, "Tell me, how do you actually do this?" And he was an academic, and he said, "Sure." And he told him, and then Bloomberg went and outpaced him. There was a person I spoke to at a cocktail party not too long ago who was a terminal operator for what was called the Optex terminals. And she said, "I was there the day they brought in the Bloomberg that took out the Optex." So there was a changing of the guard moment there. But anyway, I've been involved in technology really for 4 decades or 5 decades, depending on how you really count. And so I've seen it really evolve quite a lot. I've been something like a technology analyst for about 20 years. I spent 8 years working at IDC as their analyst on the PC desk, and then I founded Endpoint in 2005. So that's what's been going on. And I cover a broad range of topics. The endpoint in question is actually a single user device with a human interface, an IP address. And in 2005, there were only PCs, but very quickly after, there was the smartphone and then iPads and then the Internet of Things. And so there's a lot more to talk about now than there used to be.
Yeah.
I've been writing a few pieces recently on net neutrality, and I've written some before, but of course recently it's a lot hotter topic. And my view is a bit like Aaron's in that I feel like it's potentially destructive to the functioning of the internet to have these kind of different speed lanes that people can pay up for the better versions of. If you look at the underlying architecture of the internet, TCP/IP, everyone is dumping packets out into the network, and typically they're doing it by way of a short link between themselves and a backbone, and then it goes along the backbone into different servers and is handed off, and then finally goes to the other end to some server that has the information you're looking for, and then it has to make the round trip to get back to you. And in the past, the architecture, it made sense that you treated all packets the same because a given server receives a bunch of packets, they have addresses on them, that server doesn't really know where they're going, but says, I'll tell you what, this one's heading in that direction, so I'll pass it off that way. And this one's heading in this other direction, so I'll pass it off this other way. And therefore, it's always optimizing traffic, at least locally. And so that made a lot of sense. Now, if packets have a flag on them that say something like, this is a hot one, then it has to get priority. In other words, to wait in order for that to happen. So what's being proposed now is really re-empowering the service providers who were becoming purveyors of dumb pipes and making them into kind of arbiters of packets, whose packets get there first, and so on. The other guys, the users of all this stuff, Googles and Facebooks and so on, have been the beneficiaries of net neutrality for the past couple of decades, and they've built these massive businesses. And some of that power is being handed back to the old pipes guys that we used to think of as the telecom provider, but really it's Comcast and Verizon and AT&T and others like them. So problem that I have that is simply that I've seen how this works in real life, and I think of the airlines and our boarding priority, where, for example, recently I was on Lion Air, which I haven't had the pleasure of being on for quite a while, and therefore I don't have any status. And I was in Group 4. And so I stood around and waited while Group 1 and Group 2 and Group 3 all went on. And then there was all this sort of bad planning involved. People in Group 1 in first class, they don't really feel like they can get their big butts out of the way, and so they stand there blocking the rest of us. And we're all standing around, and in fact, the airline isn't getting loaded. It's not getting loaded optimally because it's being loaded according to some kind of paid priority. So, this is a kind of model for what happens to our packets once you have no net neutrality. And the problem is also that, you get what you get, right? So if I have a slow link between me and the telephone pole, then my internet service is going to be gated by that. If the source that I'm trying to get my information from has a kind of poor link to their telephone pole, then that is the thing that gates my experience. But at least I'm getting an even shot at getting my packet through the network. So if someone says, look, you have to wait, your packet has a flag on it that says you have to wait, or let's say in a polling type of environment, somebody gets 2 shots and you only get 1, so they get twice as much data at the same time as you do. well, it's just going to make your experience a lot worse. And the problem is that the base experience is okay today, and I'm paying a fee for it. So what's going to happen to the rates? Well, the carriers are very likely to create an array of rates, good, better, best. And the bottom rate may be about what I'm paying now. It's probably not going to be any less, but certainly the better ones will be more. And then at some point, I'll look at my poor, crappy service and say, oh, this is terrible. I need to do a little better. And I'll be kind of herded up to the middle level where most of the volume is going to be, and we'll all be paying a bit more. So as Aaron was saying, the carriers are looking for ways to raise their ARPUs, the average revenue per user. And so if they get a couple extra bucks a month out of all of us, then it's a job well done from their perspective.
Well, I wanted to pick up on that, what Aram had said. He had sort of implied that the increases in revenue that we'll be paying as consumers is like not even in the top 10 of the problems with net neutrality. And I just wonder, though, I mean, I live in the Austin, Texas area. I'm in a suburb, and then right past me are the rural places. And I know the rural places right now pay more than I do because I use what do I use? AT&T. But for example, in Austin itself, for several years, Google has been trying to get Google Fiber into certain neighborhoods, and AT&T, Verizon have been suing and whatnot, and it's never going to get out to the rural, much less even the suburbs. So I just wonder, and I'll toss this out to either one of you who wants to take it first, is that I think we're going to probably look at not only in terms of 2 tiers or 3 tiers of service, but in terms of payment, that we're going to have the people who can afford it the least paying far more to get basic access. Aaron, do you want to take that first? Or?
Sure. And again, let me couch this in a larger systemic set of challenges. Internet service is not the only service or product where poor people end up paying more, right? I mean, we've just had a huge national conversation about taxes, and it turns out that working people pay a much higher percentage of their income than rich people do in taxes on average because of various loopholes and shelters and hijinks. Another great example would be food.
Yeah.
There are many studies showing that poor people end up paying more for the same groceries than rich people do. And there are a variety of structural reasons for this, none of which are accidental, none of which are necessary, and all of which are to some degree engineered as the product of policy and commercial behavior. So in the case of rural connectivity, so one of the major factors that limits costs for any service, but especially for a kind of recurring utility-like service like the internet, is competition. And in a densely populated urban area, you might have 4 different companies competing to provide you with high-speed internet service. Right. And because of that, they're going to have a check on their prices, right? Anybody who pads out their price too much is just going to lose customers. The overwhelming majority of rural areas in the U.S. and poor areas in the U.S. have one internet provider. So there's no competitive incentive for them to lower their costs. And in fact, 98% of American households have at best 2 different providers for broadband, which means that, competition is really largely a myth and is not something that is going to have any kind of downward pressure on prices.
Yeah. How about you, Roger? Any comment on that?
Aaron has it right. The guys who control the markets can price as they wish, and even if you have a couple of providers, they signal each other across the market without expressly colluding. If one posts a price like a gas station, the other one reads the price and says, well, I guess that's the price today, and so they agree on price even though they haven't technically colluded. And agree on, everyone knows that oligopoly is more profitable than competition. So, Lucky Luciano figured that out. We don't want to kill each other in the mob. We want to have one mob, and I'll rule that mob, by the way, and take the biggest cut. But all you will get a much bigger cut than you would if we were all fighting each other in different cities. So Kansas City, Las Vegas, you're all reporting to me now. And as a result of that, they have nice monopoly on all the illegal businesses they did. But they're not the only one to do that. I mean, the oil companies and others also do exactly the same thing.
Yeah. I want to talk about something that I know from when I worked at AT&T years ago, both for internet connectivity and also, for example, at that time, the burgeoning cell phone market is AT&T would resell to other vendors at a below cost, well, not below cost, but at basically a little above their wholesale price. For example, just to use a round number, if it cost $100 a month for AT&T to charge a customer for X amount of usage for cell phones or for data, they would be forced to by law to sell at, let's say, if they were paying $70 per month, they would have to maybe pay $72 a month or charge $72 to $75 a month to a reseller, and then that reseller would maybe be able to undercut AT&T at $90 a month and make that $18, that profit in that little $18 because they didn't have to update the cables and whatnot. They didn't have the infrastructure AT&T did. But with net neutrality, a lot of what I hear, and again, maybe I'm wrong, it seems, oh, well, we need this to update for new lines and whatnot. By 2030, everything is going to be wireless. I mean, the idea that we're going to be having these gigantic cables and we're going to have fiber, it's going to virtually all be wireless. Is this really just AT&T and Verizon and Time Warner? And aren't these just dinosaurs really just hanging on for whatever they can for as long as they can, and they need to get out of the way of technology?
Well,
No?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So my view of that is, these guys are investing billions of dollars in 5G technology right now. And I actually don't believe that the wired portion is going to go away. Fiber is still pretty efficient for long haul. And so they'll certainly use that. But a lot of local distribution will become wireless in the 5G world. And I believe that's true. And these companies do need to recover capital investment so that they can invest in the future. I think that's a legitimate ask. But I do think that to confuse that with a sort of an excuse for why they should face billing or something, I think they're kind of unrelated. That commercially they want to do the best they can, and oh, by the way, they also have to invest in infrastructure. So it's almost like those are two different issues.
Yeah, Roger is absolutely right. And just to throw a little data into the mix, 2016 saw more investment by internet service providers in infrastructure than any year since 1998, right? And that's the year after the FCC claimed Title II authority over broadband services. So rather than having a downward pressure on investment, it actually seems to have sparked investment. Also, if you look at, these are public companies. If you look at like the balance sheets for, Verizon or AT&T, these are companies that are making like $100 billion in profits every year. So there's the notion that they need to have more discretion to act anti-competitively or charge consumers more or charge services more for access to their pipes is ludicrous. I mean, these are some of the richest companies in the world, and the whole reason that there isn't sufficient political will to fight against these deregulatory moves is because they've been spreading money around in Washington for years.
Go ahead. It's interesting, when my father was trying to come up with a business model for Ontex back in the 1960s, he said, I want to be like AT&T. This is back when AT&T was a monopoly. He said, they're a billing company. Once they're set up to go, all we have to do is keep the juice on and send the bills. Now, that's the kind of business I want to be in. Now, he didn't quite get there because it was using a computer, and the way he got around the admonishment not to arbitrage AT&T's lines was because he said we're data processing. And at the time, there was a provision for data processing that said if you do something with the data and then pass it on, not acting as a common carrier, which got decided in court and actually allowed him to operate, which was sort of an interesting moment in time. But the data processing involved was nothing other than store and forward, which you can argue wasn't very fancy. But nonetheless, was just enough of a shred of respectability to allow them to operate legally. So aspiration at the time was to become a billing company because that seemed like a great business.
Let me throw out a couple of things that people have said in regards to net neutrality and see what your takes on them. One of the reasons that a lot of the providers are using for wanting to get rid of net neutrality is what they called broadband hogs, i.e. that if you have gamers and whatnot, and they're constantly downloading, they're playing 7-8 hours a day, you know, Cars Theft 27 or whatever it is, that takes up a lot more than just me, say, Skyping with you guys or uploading, you know, an essay to my website or something. Is there any reality to that, or you know, is it just like anything else that it's going to, you know, if I'm really sick, I'm going to need to insurance more than you if you're healthy, but when you spread it out across millions of people, it averages out. Is there anything to their claims about broadband hoggery? Or?
No. From a technological standpoint, there is absolutely no threat of reaching capacity on the networks anytime soon. And as Roger was pointing out, you know, they keep building out new fiber. They're rolling out 5G. The networks are growing exponentially as the number of users are growing incrementally. So no, there's no technological limit that is creating a crisis of bandwidth hogging. It's a rhetorical strategy that's trying to set consumers against one another. And your comparison of healthcare is actually a very apt one. The whole kind of Republican argument that young, healthy people shouldn't have to pay for old, sick people flies in the very face of the kind of mathematics and social principles behind insurance as an institution.
Right.
So, you know, another good comparison would
They've never heard of actuaries, apparently.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's actuarial science, and you know, that like what if like 24-hour fitness started saying that, you know, like, well, gym hugs are coming in and using the barbells at all hours. Well, you know, guys, you set up the business model where you get all access. You know, if you think you can sell a business model where you charge people by the minute, try it out. Right.
Yeah.
And ISPs did that back in the 90s. It didn't work so well.
Yeah.
So this is pure rhetoric. There's no foundation in factual, technological, or economic reality.
Roger, do you agree?
But that having been said, video does account for something like 75% of the traffic on the web. If you look at data types, video is a very heavy data type compared to audio. You know, it was no mistake that Steve Jobs came out with the iPod first and only later other things, and really hesitated on Apple TV because they could solve the problem at the data rate required for music. But solving it for video was harder. Netflix understood this, and these things put out a front end that looked like the web, but then had this jerry-rigged back end where it sent you discs in the mail until the internet caught up. And when it did, then you can deliver video over the internet, no problem. So once you can deliver video, essentially you've tested the network to the depth that it needs to be tested. That's the most difficult thing. You know, high resolution, high frame rate video is the stuff. And as Aaron pointed out, they're building it out constantly and so on. Now, it's an interesting question because Netflix has been a beneficiary of net neutrality. They don't have to pay more for their packets, and they get delivered just like everybody else's. And now it's enough for everybody. Now, you could make an argument maybe that Netflix would want to reserve some packets so that it could make sure to deliver high-quality video to its subscribers. Turns out that it's not necessary. With a small amount of buffering, you can handle the vagaries of the internet, and you end up with a decent video experience with no stuttering. That's really the hurdle. Once we've passed that, really everything is working fine. So
let's also, sorry, go ahead.
No, please take it in.
Let's also remember we're just talking about the last mile here, right? Net neutrality is all about the tiny distance between the local hub and the consumer's home, or the business's home, and covering that space, right? So all the capacity arguments don't make any sense in that context because the internet as a whole. Let's talk about Netflix. Netflix doesn't just send their packets over the public internet. They have all of these edge of network servers that speed up and shorten the number of hops required for their video to get onto your television. Right? They actually have there are already privately owned or privately leased networks and server arrays throughout the internet infrastructure that you can pay for to have a higher quality data rate, as well as kinds of what are known as peering arrangements between large networks, where they kind of make a quid pro quo agreement to take each other's traffic in exchange for the other company doing the same. So the concept that the internet's going to get clogged up because of bandwidth hogs doesn't even match the technical reality of what's happening when people use bandwidth. The companies that are making these arguments are not actually operating all of those relays that constitute the internet backbone. All that they're doing is selling that last little bit between your house and the internet writ large. And that little bit is relatively cheap to maintain, and even to expand once you've laid the basic framework, which they already have, right? So there's zero chance of, you can have a whole block full of bandwidth hogs I'm saying this in Gen X air quotes, playing Call of Duty 24/7 on their 8K televisions, and the worst thing that would happen is Verizon would have to build another line, the last mile from the network to that block. It's not a big economic or technological intervention required to deal with those kinds of demands. And the notion that they would have to substantially change the shape of the internet in a way that will not only raise prices, but that will exclude competition, that will create the natural conditions for oligopolies to grow through vertical and horizontal integration, that could have repercussions for human rights, for access to knowledge, for participation in the political and cultural process, for political dissidence, for subaltern cultural groups to find a voice and to find each other as a byproduct of these decisions, just to save a couple of bucks on supporting the last mile infrastructure that they've already sold to the consumer under the guise of all you can eat. It's insulting. Yeah. It's actually an insult to American consumers and citizens.
Aaron, this raises an interesting question too, because for years Comcast, that supplies my broadband, has been trying to sell me a business grade of service, and I said, well, given net neutrality, what are you selling me? I mean, what do you have that you can be selling me that you aren't already giving me? Because I thought you were supposed to be giving me less service because there was only one service. So that remains unanswered. I don't really know the answer to that question. It would be interesting to know what they think they've been selling. They continue to try to sell me that. And so I think, well, maybe at some point they'll actually have something to deliver when they can give me essentially a higher grade of service for money. Because through now, I don't think it's legal for them to do that, but they've been trying anyway.
Yeah, and I wanted to pick up on another thing that's sort of related to the broadband hog argument, is that if Time Warner Cable might slow down something from Netflix if they don't pay a higher fee, we're just seeing Disney trying to acquire 20th Century Fox, which I think is a terrible idea. But what happens if Disney Fox says, well, TWC, Time Warner Cable, is trying to screw us. We're gonna go into the ISP business or set up our own thing. So instead of being able to go to a single hub to say Hulu or Netflix to download whatever, we're seeing it with the TV networks. We're seeing it with everything. I mean, it's trying to become more like cable TV. Whereas one of the good things about the internet is you could download. You could pay your internet fee for the month to your ISP, and then if you wanted to download something and watch on YouTube or Netflix or whatnot, it was all covered under that one fee. To me, this seems like this is just a kick in the ass for more corporate conglomeration and mergers.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's the simple answer. Yeah. I used to have a block diagram that I used in speeches. Well, it's actually been really close to 2 decades. But it was basically a series of capabilities that in theory you had to have under one roof, and what you had to have was determined by competitors were doing. And at the time, it was covering PCs, and so it was seen from the perspective of device providers. But there were things like pipes that went along with that, and then there was content. And content was broadly defined: software, entertainment, content, and all kinds of stuff like that. And so you could peg each of the players and say, well, what businesses are they in? And if they didn't have something that a competitor had, like if somebody had devices plus pipes, but somebody else had only devices, then essentially they were at a competitive disadvantage. And so there was a tendency within a particular industry to start aggregating. And I think that pressure continues to be kind of major economic pressure per market. So, this is what's happening in technology. There's something else happening in pharmaceutical, but it's probably similar. So, this is the issue. So if, for example, Disney says we need our own distribution, in other words, we're content and we need pipes, and you'd say, fine, and do you need devices as well? Because somebody might look around and say, well, we've got pipes and content, but we also have devices. And so now, like, let's say Apple, we can deliver to you all one package, isn't that convenient? And now you've got everybody else scrambling to make partners that you either share in that way or you acquire. But you have to have access to these other blocks. And some of my blocks are completely irrelevant now. I mean, the market's totally changed. I think one of them was portals, and portals don't matter anymore. I mean, when have you ever been to the front page of Wikipedia? You probably have never even seen it. You go in through the side door, because no one goes in through a portal to any place anymore, except maybe Yahoo.
I want to talk about net neutrality's effect on innovation. And instead of looking forward, which we can't know, 20 years ago when I was working at AT&T, they were against net neutrality even back then. And I'm wondering, it's easy to make fun of the internet, say, well, it's all pornography, and people, saying that they just tasted great kale on Facebook, and people with their headphones and their little earbuds and on their cell phone walking around like zombies. But by the same token, if we had no net neutrality 20 years ago, would we have Facebook today? Would we have Netflix? And so if we go back and look, what has net neutrality given us in the last 20, 25 years? Aaron, if you want to start.
Well, as I said in my short introduction, the entire internet as we know it is the product of net neutrality, or as it used to be called, common carriage, right? The principle that the providers of data could not discriminate between the sources of those data when providing them to consumers is the most important single factor that led to that led to the .com era, Web 2.0, the rise of the smartphone and app first, the rise of social media, all of the major milestones that have caused the internet to become this kind of global cultural infrastructure and business infrastructure and political infrastructure that has changed our lived experience so greatly that my kids can't fathom what life was like without an internet, are the result of net neutrality. And look, you can look back at the history of communications media and see that when distribution technologies are siloed for different content providers, which is, as Roger was saying, the inevitable outcome of the end of net neutrality, it leads to market paralysis. Do you remember like HD DVD versus Blu-ray, right? Where you had like 3 Hollywood studios behind one format and 2 behind the other format, and each of them wouldn't release their content on the other one's platform. Yeah. These kinds of format wars always end up in deadlocks, and always because consumers simply don't have either the money or the expertise and time to figure out like which set of technologies they want to invest in. A television is a big ticket item. An iPad is a big ticket item. A laptop is a big ticket item. And $100 ISP bill per month is a big ticket item. You can't ask me to pay for 3 of those instead of 1 of those just to get access to all the stuff that I want. Yes. And furthermore, when Facebook was starting out, they had zero capitalization, right? It was just a startup enterprise with a slightly better idea than MySpace had or that Friendster had. When YouTube was starting out, it was just one of a number of sites that was taking advantage of the new kind of growing broadband audience to provide a place for people to share their home video.
Yeah.
These sites could not have grown into the market-defining titans that they are if they had to pay some kind of massive upfront fee to compete with the existing titans in their day. So one of the primary effects of ending net neutrality is basically to freeze in place the winners and the losers at a given moment in time, 2018, and to prevent new entrants from building up the kind of momentum that's going to allow them to become the titans of the future, which is terrible.
So, Rod, let me just pick up on what Aaron said, because he said his kids couldn't imagine a world without the stuff that net neutrality has brought. Let me just give you an example. You can pick another one if this one isn't a good one. Netflix, 15 years ago, there were still blockbusters around. Blockbusters seemed dominant. Now Netflix is something like 10 or 20 times market capital that Blockbuster ever had, and it's because of having this free, or not free, but the access that net neutrality granted. If we didn't have net neutrality, just so that people may understand, could Netflix have even had a business model?
Well, yes, but it would have been severely limited because they would have had to pick a channel, and that channel would have been less than 100% of the market, so it would have been limited in some way. My experience with how free competition markets settle into oligopolies, they usually get down to 2 to 3 camps at the most, and those camps harden in, and they sort of buy up any little place around, or put them out of business, and then there's 2 or 3. So you have Microsoft, Google, and Apple, for example, in some markets. So the only choice is, let's say, smartphone operating environments or for browsers, things like that. So it's necessarily limiting. I like the idea that Aaron put out of the market freezing from the moment that net neutralities end, because all the players are in a position at the moment. Some of them are in advantageous positions, and so they can maintain them using the current set of rules or the ones that are unrolling now. And it would be very difficult for new players. So what that would do is it would have the effect of stifling innovation, because new players, and I do know people who are in the software development and they're seeing it right now. They can't get up out of the obscurity that they're in. They can't get into the big forums because everything's already spoken for. That may be a little bit beyond the scope of net neutrality alone. I think there has been consolidation in technology in general. And once the winners are in place, Google do no evil. Now it's, well, we'll do evil if we feel like it, but you can't do any evil because we're the guys who are running this thing, and so we get to say what's evil and what's not, and so on. So you get that. Everyone complains until they're the incumbent, and then all of a sudden they shut up. So we're kind of in that environment at this point, and technology over 30 or 40 years has matured, and there are now winners in place. What's interesting about net neutrality in this context is that almost all of the ISPs are older than the technology business. Communications has been around since the middle of the 19th century. So you basically have companies that have a long history and old wealth involved with them, who are trying to reassert their position against the kind of newcomers of the internet. So it's really a gang war between 2 different types of players, and we'll see how it all plays out. I mean, as the consumers, we can be sure that we'll get stepped on by the elephants. I mean, there's that outcome is assured. But as to who's going to actually win, well, you don't know, because you've got folks like Netflix sitting at table with Verizon and arguing for access. And I imagine that they'll have a long discussion about it, since it's not so simple.
I think it's important to place what Roger was saying and my earlier point in the context of, again, none of this is new. It's like Battlestar Galactica. Like, all this has happened before and it will happen again. So there is when a new distribution channel for communication emerges, there is a kind of natural progression in the business model for these channels, right? And the first progression is, well, let's invest in it and let's let's provide incentives for people to use the channel to distribute it. So, we just created, cable television. Who wants to give us some content for our cable network so we have something to show the consumers? We'll just provide it for free to the. And that's part of why, for instance, British New Wave became such a thing in the U.S. in the early 1980s, is because the American record labels, didn't want to distribute their work via MTV, but the British record labels, who were hungry to get access to the American audiences, were happy to share their content. American record labels wanted to get paid for the use of their music videos online. And then things progress, whereas the distribution channel becomes more established. Well, all of a sudden, they say, hey, now we've got an audience. Maybe you want to sell stuff to our audience. So why don't you create some content services or some commerce services that can float on top of our network? And that's kind of what .com 1.0 was. You saw the Amazons of the world emerging. You saw newspapers starting to put their websites online. Then as the audience grows and becomes more differentiated, you get an advertising business. And you say, hey, not only can we connect you with customers, but we can actually connect you with audiences who are segmentable. And we, or some infrastructure company, and this is really what Google is. Google was never just a search engine company. They were always an advertising and consumer data network. They say, hey, we can find urban 20-something white guys in the market for a car. We can find expectant mothers from rural communities. We can develop whatever kind of demographic slice you want and package together enough of them to sell you access to that demographic slice. And then comes the next phase, and that's the phase that we're in now, which is the payola phase. And the payola phase says, we own so much customer attention, so much audience attention, that you should pay us just for access to our own customers who are already paying us for access to you, right? So we're getting paid on both sides for the exchange to be made between the customers and the companies that are providing them with products and services. We saw this happen in radio, right? That's what the whole payola scandals were about.
Yeah.
It wasn't enough that the radio networks got to aggregate audiences and sell ads to them. They also wanted to sell record labels access to those same audiences that they were providing ads to. So this is, you can basically think of the end of net neutrality as a giant payola scheme by the ISPs who want to control access to their audiences so tightly that any third party is going to have to pay a fee to get access to those audiences.
Well, let me just give you another argument that people who are pro-net neutrality would use, and they'd say, well, most other countries, or a good portion of other countries, already have some form of what we would call net neutrality, and they're doing okay. Can you, either of you guys say, well, the EU, Israel, South America does this, and what the difference is? I mean, how has this played out in other countries, pro or con? Roger, if you want to go first.
I'm not sure I completely understood the question.
Well,
how is net neutrality played out in other countries?
Yeah, because some people have said that certain countries already have what we would call net neutrality, what we want to bring in now, and they've never had, they've never had the free, they've never had the parsing of services down like that. Not everyone follows the current American model that could be going away. So are those countries that did not have net neutrality, as we call it, have they suffered? Have they been as innovative as the U.S. has?
Yeah, I don't have enough information about how other countries' legal systems operate.
Okay.
I know that, for example, in China, there's a lot of regulation of the internet, but they're not specifically dealing with principles of net neutrality. I think, in other words, they're still delivering packets pretty much on a neutrality scheme. What they're doing instead is spying on the content and trying to control who, what, where. I know that Russia has talked about trying to do some things in that area, and I think in as much as any other government is trying to regulate the internet, it has to do more with exchange of content. Talk about Iran shutting down services when there was disturbance, domestic disturbances recently. So they just shut off an ISP for a while and said you can't deliver any packets because we're trying to control the political situation. So I've seen that, but I really haven't seen or even heard about instances where folks are saying, coup for you and one for me. I haven't seen that type of non-neutrality scheme, though maybe Aram has different experience.
Yeah, so the American context is fairly unique, and it is for two reasons. Number one is we have a First Amendment, which other countries don't have, that explicitly prohibits the government from adopting any policies that inhibit free speech, which has been pretty broadly interpreted in the courts. And there's no question that that sharing content over the internet is a form of protected speech in the U.S. context. The other difference between us and most other countries, notable exceptions being countries like China, Russia, India, and Brazil, which are much more authoritarian than even we've become in this last year, is that we're huge, right? We have 320 million people. We take up most of a continent. And so, whereas in a smaller European country, if you look at the Scandinavian countries, or if you look at South Korea, they actually have much better broadband than we do. The number of bits per second they can get is much cheaper than what we get in the U.S. But that's because the government was able to subsidize and manage the rollout of a national infrastructure because their nations are relatively small compared to ours. In the U.S., and this is again to be the historian. The same was true of the telephone, the telegraph, the railroads. In order to incentivize the build out of these massive coast-to-coast networks that could actually connect our country and turn us into a single market, the U.S. government has had to incentivize private parties to undertake some of the expense of building out those infrastructures. And we have all kinds of ways of incentivizing them. We give them semi-protected monopolies. We exert, eminent domain on their behalf to give them access to the land that they need to build it. We give them tax breaks. We do all kinds of things to get these companies to spend their billions of dollars on building the infrastructure. Norway never had to do that. South Korea never had to do that. They're so tiny they could just, spend a couple $1 million. And I'm exaggerating, but
Maybe
the economic maybe a couple $1 billion, but the economic expense is minuscule compared to building out and continuing to grow and maintain the U.S. network. So because on the one hand, we have this ongoing necessity of commercial investment in the infrastructure in the U.S. because of our size, and on the other hand, we have this constitutional protection for inclusion and free speech. We have a somewhat unique situation where since Ma Bell got broken up in the early 1980s, our strategy for communication networks as a country has been, let us have a highly regulated, oligopolistic, quasi-competitive market that provides enough incentive for these guys to build out, maintain, and grow their networks, while also maintaining protections for freedom of speech and universal access and inclusion. And that compromise is exactly what gave rise to the principle of common carriage in the telephone days, which actually also governed the internet through the rollout of DSL, because that was all done via telephone lines. And it's only since we've had cable and fiber kind of take over as the dominant form of broadband that there's even been a chink in the armor for the massive oligopolists to argue against it in the U.S. But you'll notice nothing that they say proposes another method of simultaneously incentivizing commercial investment and protecting free speech. They'll just point to other countries with no context and say, well, they don't do it the same there, and they're fine. Yeah. That kind of an argument is totally facile. It doesn't make any logical sense.
Well, we're recording this now, and I'm going to start wrapping up, but we're recording this now in mid-January of 2018, a couple of months after the FCC decision to basically back to the end of net neutrality. Where do we stand now for people who are pro-net neutrality? Is the Supreme Court going to be the last chance for that? And the idea, for example, that the FCC has basically punted on this issue, and they, I think, want to turn it over to FTC, which has been missing in action for the last 30 years with things such as the Disney Fox proposed merger. Is this basically a fait accompli that net neutrality is dead? Roger, if you want to go.
Yeah, I would say that the prospects for net neutrality are fairly dim. There's likely to be a number of civil suits, and there'll be some legal action that may delay some rollouts, but rely on the Supreme Court for any particular solace at this point, given its composition. Even the kind of centrist members are likely to rule to the right on this one, would be my guess. I would look to the administration or the Congress for any help. So you've got that. There hasn't been any real antitrust enforcement in this country. Well, Penn Jackson and the Microsoft case, you saw how that went. The judge got removed from the case, died not long afterward, and Microsoft was supposedly chastened, but they're back. So pretty much, doing the same thing that they ever did and more so. And Apple was maybe worse than Microsoft, but never got called on the carpet because they just were more discreet about how they operated. So you've got Google the same way, with these enormous expenditures of lobbying dollars in Washington. I don't expect things to change for these guys. I think it's all pretty much in place. And, obviously we can't predict the ultimate future if the American public is a bit disgusted about the way the government's operating right now. Some people are and some people aren't. Then you'll see evidence of that in 2018 November elections. And if there's a change in Congress, that would be at least a signal that the wind might be turning the other direction, but I wouldn't count on it. Given the history of the United States, we all wanted Jack Kennedy. We thought he was pretty good, and he was assassinated. And there's been a lot of hope for other folks like that, including Barack Obama, and you saw what that came to. So, the body politic in the U.S. is, I don't want to use the word conservative because I think they don't really conserve anything. They do a lot of destroying things. But whatever it is that's motivating them, I think they represent the bulk of opinion, maybe by a very small amount. And so it'll be a pitched battle. There's also this question of tactics. The right has a tendency to fall neatly into hierarchies and to act like an army. The left tends to argue and be, somewhat democratic about it, which does not make for a good fighting force. So I think these are kind of structural issues that we have around politics that if you look at it that way, you can assume that the right will tend to win, and therefore net neutrality repeal will remain in place.
And Roger, isn't it also true, and I'll go to Aram in a second, that, in the last few years we've had copious videos of black men being shot or killed or beaten by cops and whatnot, and the Black Lives Matter and whatnot. So here we have some visceral stuff, and a surprising amount of people are not just Klansmen out, and are sort of like, so what? Net neutrality is pretty abstruse compared to watching a human being getting beaten or shot, and most people are like, oh, I'm gonna take it up the ass again, so I'll just sit back and enjoy it, kind of thing.
Right. So I guess the answer is, most common folks don't really understand the arguments about net neutrality. It's relatively complicated, and so they're just going to kind of ride with whatever the opinion leaders say, and the opinion leaders themselves are being paid a lot of the time will be saying whatever their paymasters want them to. So depending on who shouts loudest and most articulately and a certain amount of serendipity, that'll be the outcome. So,
Aram, are you also dim on, is it pretty much a fait accompli, net neutrality is gone?
No, nothing's a fait accompli. I agree with Roger that signs are pretty lead to pessimism at this point, and obviously we're in a highly corporatist authoritarian moment, but this too shall pass. There's the future is a long time. Yeah. So I think of it in terms of leverage. So first of all, is there the potential for a citizen or consumer groundswell of support for net neutrality? And I think the answer is clearly yes, right? It was only 4 years ago that John Oliver got millions of people, so many people to flood the FCC website with pro-net neutrality messages that they crashed the site. The Russian other interventionist forces saw so much consumer support for net neutrality this time around that 500,000 of their bots had to flood the FCC with fake comments against net neutrality to balance the consumer and citizen sentiment. So I think there is support. So then the question becomes, what kinds of leverage do we have to turn that broad spread support into some kind of power? And, just thinking about it at the moment, I see basically five methods, right? The three branches of government, plus commercial and technological intervention. So let's talk about the three branches of government. So there's already a CRA in Congress, a congressional, what does it stand for? Congressional, I don't know. A CRA basically is a rule, congressional rule authority, I don't know. But there are something like 60 senators now who are supporting congressional intervention at the Senate level into reversing the FCC's decision. Ultimately, that would have to have a supermajority or be ratified by the president, neither of which looks likely. So I think it's good as a show of support. It shows that our legislators are largely with us, and this happens across the aisle. Obviously, it's almost all the Democrats or all the Democrats, and more than a handful of Republicans are supporting this. So that's legislative. And also, of course, if the Democrats take back the House or move much closer to a parity in the House in 2018, that could exert some pressure on the regulatory agencies as well. Executive, Ajit Pai, who runs the FCC, is a shill. He used to be the second in command lawyer for Verizon, and he still acts like he is. He's a really dishonest, smarmy dude. I watched all the hearings, and it just made my skin crawl. I won't get into ad hominem attacks, but I propose no place in our regulatory executive bodies at this point, and obviously the White House is a lost cause. The courts, as Roger was saying, the Supreme Court probably would not come down on the right side of this issue, but there has been some court support at the appellate level for net neutrality in the past, so I could see that being a bulwark that kind of slows down the process. And then at the state level, there are several states that are working on regulating net neutrality as a state issue, not as a federal issue, and that's entirely within the legal bounds of possibility.
I was gonna follow up on that with Governor Cuomo in California, and also I was just reading before we started that some actual local municipalities, states, especially in the rural, are looking to form co-ops to keep costs down.
Which is the same thing that happened with telephone.
Yeah, so
back in like the 1930s.
Yeah, so do you think that might be the way to get around this? Is that a lot of people are just going to say, well, we'll just do it ourselves, the communities, states, counties?
Yes, and that's clearly already happening. As you mentioned, there are co-op efforts. There are both municipal and state legislative and regulatory efforts. There are even technological interventions like mesh networks that can be used to kind of bypass the kind of commercial last mile infrastructure that are becoming more and more technologically and socially feasible. So I think there actually is a lot of leverage that can be brought to bear. The issue is, if you look at an analogous industry would be the energy industry, if you look at how the extraction industries have lobbied to make it illegal for people like in California or in Florida to set up their own solar panels, right? Which is obviously like the most efficient way to get energy in Florida because the sun shines 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Again, I'm exaggerating, but there's a lot of sun. What my concern would be that communications conglomerate lobbyists in Washington and in the states would work really hard to outlaw these kinds of co-ops and these kinds of mesh networks, in the same way that that they're trying to outlaw certain kinds of user and encryption to prevent people from hiding packets from the watchful eyes of corporate and state surveillors. So look, it is a battle. There are many, it's a war. There are many fronts in the war. I don't think anything is a fait accompli. I draw inspiration and hope from the fact that so many people who are worried about basic issues, healthcare, education, access to services, ability to find a job, are still engaged in this issue. That means that there is at least an inkling that this matters, that this is a human rights issue, that this is an equity issue.
Yeah.
And I think we have to keep hammering that point. That's why I'm doing this interview with you, is to help get that word out.
So let me just wrap up here, give you some closing remarks. I will link to both Aram's American University webpage and Endpoint Technologies webpage for Roger. Roger, let me just ask you any final comments on anything regarding these issues.
Well, yeah, I'm probably a notch more cynical than Aram is, but I think that's appropriate because neither of us knows the real outcome. We just look at the landscape from our own perspectives. I tend to be kind of Eeyore about all this stuff. Maybe he's more Winnie the Pooh. But you need that spread of opinion. And obviously, we're going to keep talking about this because it is important. And in as much as we can lead anyone in the opinion front, we'll do our best to kind of keep the network open for everyone to use.
Aram, any final comments from you?
No, I agree entirely with Dan. Look, this is. I'll say this. So during the net neutrality hearings, Ajit Pai tried to make out like all of the pro-net neutrality protesters were making a mountain out of a molehill, and it was a tempest in a teapot. And he said that laughingly, ha, 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 this is really a very wonky issue. And so what I would say to your viewers is beware of wonky issues. Wonkiness is what the powerful use to make the powerless uninterested in the exercise of power, right? Wonkiness doesn't mean anything. This is no more wonky than like the issue of immigration or the issue of food stamps or the issue of whether we go to war in country X or Y or Z. This is really about, do human beings have the freedom to express themselves, to connect with one another, to organize with one another, to get access to the knowledge that they need to lead healthy, happy lives, to exercise life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is really what net neutrality is about. And as long as we keep that top in mind, the policy issues become self-evident, right? It's really very stark. So push away the wonkiness, forget about Title I versus Title II, and focus on the question, are different voices from different communities going to be allowed to participate in the global communication network on equal terms or not? That's the only question that's important at all. I'm going to continue, like Roger, to spread the word and take advantage of every opportunity I have to share my expertise.
Well, Roger and Aram, thank you both.
Thank you, Dan.